Well, welcome. Today's topic is inside tropical rainforests. So we'll be delving much more deeply than we have before into the structures and forms, what makes tropical rainforest what they are. And overall, life on planet Earth is referred to as the biosphere. It consists of all the ecosystems that are present on the planet. Tropical rainforests, savannas, tundra, those are names that refer to large-scale communities that have a lot in common with each other. And so these biomes, you know them, you've heard of them: tropical rainforests, savanna, tundra, deserts, chaparral. That's ours. These patterns can be seen in different parts of the planet, but there's enough similarity that we want to group them together because they have very consistent features. And these features are really, when you get down to it, determined by two factors: temperature and the amount of precipitation. So that's really going to affect what type of ecosystem that you find. And so, of course, we're focused on the tropical forest biome in this class. And it occurs globally, equatorially. That is, where it's warm, close to the equator. And so a scene like this could be really taken in any tropical forest, and you wouldn't be able to know, not looking much greater detail, where we are, because there's very consistent and similar features that have converged. Being warm and being wet leads to this lush green jungle of life. And so the term tropical rainforest, the way it's used is not exactly technically the definition that Holdridge would use. So we revisit this. We've seen this before. So Holdridge's rainforest refers to a certain amount of precipitation and temperature and evapotranspiration ratio. So very, very specific. But when people generally use the term tropical rainforest, they're including also the wet forests and the moist forests as well. And so I'm going to do that as well. And so really it's all of these that we'll be referring to as tropical rainforests. So by Holdridge's definition, a tropical rainforest is non-seasonal. It's consistent rain year-round. But in actuality, in these other systems, you might find some seasonality, a wet and dry season. But they are characterized by having super humid conditions. So the tropical rainforest biome is known for high biodiversity and complex physiognomy. Funny word, huh? So that physiognomy refers to the physical structure of the ecosystem. So let's talk about these in more depth. So biodiversity refers to the number of species that you find in habitat, or species richness is another way to refer to that. And let's take a look at this figure here. This is from your book, and it's showing you the number of bird species that you find. Each of those squares represents 300 square miles approximately, and the number of species that you find in these areas. And you can see, if you can move yourself closer and closer and closer to the equator, you've got a greater and greater number of species, an amazing number of bird species here down by Panama, for example. And so there's a correlation between how close you are to the equator and the number of species, not just for birds, but that pattern is seen for other species, other groups as well. And then biodiversity also refers to genetic diversity among a population. So even within a species, there can be diversity or variety within the genes of that species. Now, the complex physiognomy, that is, if you recall, the structure of the forest. It is very complex. It's very hard to draw. There's a lot going on here. For one thing, it's huge. It's voluminous. There's a high biomass, greater than any other ecosystem I can think of. If you took all of this plant material, and animal too, and stacked it up, you'd see it's a great deal of life. And that life is very structurally elaborate, the plants here. We've got, vines, we've got palms, we have lianas, we have canopy, we have understory. There's stuff going on in the forest floor. So there's a lot of verticalness to it, a lot of structured layers. Reminds me perhaps of Manhattan. There's a lot going on at many different levels. Same with our tropical rainforest. And that makes for a lot of microhabitats. Like what the conditions are right up here in the emergent layer are very different than the conditions in the forest floor, for example. And so you'll find species that only inhabit here or here, and they can be very different from one another. We can have many species. In fact, this complex physiognomy stimulates biodiversity because there's so many different ways to live, different resources that could be had up in the sun, on the floor, different possibilities of things to eat. That means that many different species can evolve and take hold. So it's very lush and complex. Like I say, very difficult to draw, if you can imagine trying to draw this scene here, with all kinds of plants and trees and vines. The trunks have lichens and mosses on them. In general, though, it's rather a monotonous green, green, green. And only occasionally will you see plants that are in bloom, orchids, etc. Only occasionally. And only occasionally will you see a tree that lacks leaves that's dropped its leaves. Mostly it's just wall of green. So the trees can be tall and of many different species. And so it's not just the same trees over and over like you would find here walking through redwood forest. You'll have many different species, and most of them are broadleaf. What I'm saying is that they're not needles, so broadleaf and evergreen, so keeping their leaves year-round. And the sizes, well, it could be huge, 150 feet, even 300 feet is possible. Now, this doesn't compare to other forests. There are other forests that have taller trees, certainly, but they're pretty tall. And the boles, well, actually, let me define this word for you. The bole refers to, I think, what you would probably call the trunk of the tree. So I'm tracing here, this is the bole, and this is the canopy. And so we see that word a lot in our book. So the boles of these trees are very straight and slender, and the leaves tend to be at the top. So it's a certain look to that tree. So I'm going to take you with me here in Panama. So I'm nearly to the top of the Canopy Tower on the Pipeline Road in Gamboa, Panama. It's just after sunrise. What a view. A rare view of the canopy level of this rainforest. Some howler monkeys in the background, rumbling, growling. People too. The occasional tree that pops out are emergent trees. They grow a bit taller than the rest of the canopy. capturing the sunlight. So there's plants of scattered sizes. It's complex. I know that you probably will see, and in the videos I've assigned, they talk about the different layers, but it's honestly not so clear. It's a jumble. But we can talk generally. Scattered are the very, very tall emergent trees that occasionally appear here and there. They have their crowns poking up above the canopy. The canopy layer is where the crowns of the trees touch or overlap, and it's basically one continuous ceiling, or so to speak, of the rainforest. And so that's where a lot of the life is, in the canopy. And animals can freely go between the crown of one tree to another tree. And then below is the understory. Although it's not really clearly delineated, this is where the understory starts. But the understory doesn't receive as much sun. And then between the canopy and the understory, that captures most of the sunlight that's available. 99%, in fact. And so the forest floor is actually kind of dark. Hello. You're finding me today in Panama. I'm in a wet tropical forest. It's the end of July, particularly hot time, low season apparently for visitors. I've been walking on the pipeline trail. The person who passed me was probably involved with some of the research here because it's limited access. It's part of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And we were fortunate enough to hire bird guide Jose, who has been showing us some incredible sights. It's a very lush forest. You can see the thick understory of vegetation, very dense vegetation. With so much density, it means there's a lot of places that can be lived. There's a lot of habitat. Kind of reminds me of maybe New York City, in that there's many different layers, many different places that animals can find to live. And the diversity here is great, partly for that reason. Forest floor has quite a bit of fallen leaves, which decay actually pretty rapidly. That causes there to be nutrients available for the trees and plants that live here. Very lush, very humid. In the understory, you find a lot of palms. They tend to dominate. That's where they excel. And palms, what's a palm? I'm sure you could know it when you see it, but what a palm is, it's an unbranched evergreen tree with a single flexible, slender stem. And so they are narrow. They actually allows them to be flexible and move in the wind. And they have long feather or fan-shaped leaves, which are called fronds. You can see all the palms. So on the forest floor, you find smaller plants as well, shrubs, herbs. And because of the lack of light, the vegetation on the forest floor is fairly easy to traverse through. So it's not impenetrable. The leaf litter is thin, not because there's not leaves coming down. There are continuously leaves that are falling down, but the decomposition of those leaves is rapid. It's a great turnaround rate. So this is where the life is. The life is within the forest, the richness, the nutrients, where the nutrients are is within the forest, making this so rich. It's not within the soil. In fact, it's very common to have red, acidic, high clay soils like you see here on this riverbank, which is ironic because how rich the rainforest is, you would think, well, it must be because of the soil, but it's not. All the nutrients are in use. Now, an exception would be floodplains, where nutrients tend to settle, and so they're rich. And so occasionally here and there, you will find an area that's been disturbed. Here's a freshly fallen tree, which is the death of this tree, but an opportunity for another. So this is the formation of a light gap. So it looks like they had to cut it to be able to allow people to pass on this trail. So the rainforest is a very dynamic system. Constantly branches are falling, trees are falling, bromeliads, other epiphytes, palm fronds, leaves, fruits, and occasionally rather large openings can happen because of like a tree fall, which could knock down other trees or vegetation with it, leaving a light gap. This is an example of a light gap. A light gap would be an opportunity for a tree to be able to get a start because the rainforest is so heavily vegetated. Any small seedling would have a difficulty being able to get enough light for photosynthesis to get a start. But when there is a branch that falls or a tree that falls and creates a gap in the canopy, then that's an opportunity. And so any seeds that might be present there would have the opportunity to take hold and start growing in the light gap. So it's all a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And you never know when a light gap will be available and an opportunity arises. And so because of the continual nature of light gaps forming and then growth happening, it gives the forest a very patchy appearance. As I was saying, that the physiognomy is not so simple as, the stratified layers. When you've got patches that have very different characteristics because of the light gap. This is a Cecropia tree. It's taken hold in this light gap. It's a pioneer species. It does well with a little competition for light. It's a very distinctive leaf. So the Cecropia tree is one to take advantage of a light gap because it is a very rapid growing plant. And so given that opportunity, it will grow. But over time, it doesn't have a competitive advantage. And so what we see is a changing succession. I'm sure you've heard that term. It's a pattern of temporal change in the species composition and the physiognomy of an ecosystem from the time it's disturbed onward. And so most immediately you see fast-growing sun-dependent species, like I just showed you, the Cecropia, and they grow, and other species will grow and become, take advantage of that. So you see a lot of trees with very thin boles because they're shooting upwards, and that over time you will see shrubs and vines and a dense tangle of growth, and over time it will lead to more slow-growing, shade-tolerant species, which will then outcompete those pioneer species. So it's dynamic. So let's talk about the leaves in the tropical rainforest. A very distinctive look to them. Often they're oval and unlobed and have smooth margins, like you see here, which makes it tough for those trying to ID it because it's a very common form. Being large is another characteristic. And you find both simple and compound leaves. So a simple leaf shown here and here, and this is a compound leaf, and a parrot. In fact, this one's called palmately compound because it almost looks like fingers coming off of a palm, the way it's arranged. The leaves can be very thick and leathery, like you see here, even thick enough to engrave our college's name. Drip tips are common, and drip tips facilitate water flowing off the leaves. So this is a drip tip right there. Some trees are deciduous, that is, they drop their leaves. We see that here in the temperate ecosystems, but often when we think about trees dropping leaves, it's like fall time, whereas in the tropics, it's not that. The trees will drop their leaves in response to being too dry. And so it dries them out to have all those leaves. And so when it gets dry, they can drop them. And then there's a pattern that correlates with the flowering and the fruiting and the whole annual cycle of the tree. Insect damage is quite common. There's a lot of insects. You can see evidence here of herbivory. So plants have a disadvantage in not being able to move when predators come. So herbivory refers to eating of plant material, so herbivores. And a significant cause of herbivory in the rainforests are insects. And leafcutter ants alone cause a significant amount of defoliation. Another characteristic we talk about leaves, we have to mention that some leaves have plants growing on them. So those are called epiphyls. See epiphyls, which are plants that grow on plants. So that would be things like little tiny lichens and mosses and liverworts. And they get established after a microbial community has started growing on the leaf, and then it can go through succession itself to have plants. And the advantage, of course, would be that it just gives them that much more, brings them that much closer to sunlight. Let's talk roots. So some interesting adaptations in rainforest roots are buttressed roots. You can see here. what you call buttress roots. And so it's helping the tree stabilize against wind. It also is what naturally happens when, well, the nutrients that are in the soil are mostly in the upper few inches. And so to be able to take advantage of that, the roots are staying near the surface. And like we can see here in this tree that's been tipped, most of the roots are just at the surface. And so that's adaptation to take advantage of the nutrients, which are only coming to this ecosystem through the decomposition that's happening in the top few inches. And then another type of root formation are called prop roots.
This is a tree that has prop roots. You can see the roots extending.
So now let's head on over to the other end and talk about tropical rainforest tree crowns. So if it's a canopy tree, it's going to take advantage of capturing as much sunlight as possible. And so a characteristic shape for a canopy tree crown would be to branch out, and branching out from those branches to create what's been described as an umbrella-like shape, or also called sympodial. Now, an understory tree would have a different type of shape. It would have branches that would go out laterally or sideways from a main trunk. And if that's the case, it's called monopodial. In the tropical rainforest, you may find flowers, and it really is not a particular time of the year. It really depends on the flowers, on the plant species, when they flower, and then subsequently when they fruit. And so in any month, likely something will be in flower. The flowers tend to be colorful and large, fragrant and nectar rich, and all of that is an attempt to attract animal pollinators. Plants are not able to move from place to place, and so, but they need to spread their pollen, and so they're dependent upon animals to do that for them. Very commonly would be birds, and when you see a red
Heliconia flowers adapted to be pollinated by
hummingbirds, or orange or yellow, also hummingbird pollinated. When you see white, which is very visible at night, that refers to, that is to attract bats. And you can see the position of this sea bean flower is perfect for a bat flyby. And of course, insects are very important as animal pollinators for rainforest plants. An unusual characteristic of rainforest plants, some that exhibit, is having that flower and then later the fruit coming right off of the main stems, or even the trunk here, as you see in the jackfruit. And that's called cauliflory. This here is coffee. And the fruits and inside the seeds that result from the pollination, the plants are dependent upon animals once again. Because naturally a seed would just simply fall right below to the base of the parent plant. But the problem is, of course, the parent plant would shade the young seedling, and that wouldn't be as successful for them. So it'd be better if the seed can get a little further away. And so there's adaptation for that to attract animals over to gather seeds and then take them off and take them somewhere else, like you can see this cassowary doing. The fruits, many of them are small to mid-sized and fleshy and delicious to attract the animal disperser. This is the seed pod of a legume, long flattened. And some seeds, however, are not animal dependent but wind dispersed, as you can see here in this woody vine seed pod and seeds. So there's a lot of variation in the forms, the plant growth forms in a tropical rainforest, more so than in other biomes. Aside from having trees and shrubs, you can also find vines and lianas, epiphytes, and hemiepiphytes, and we'll talk about all these. So vines are the climbers. They really have a role in tying the forest together. And animals can make their way through this vine highway from place to place in the rainforest. The vines are climbing up towards light, and because, of course, they need it for photosynthesis, and that then competes with trees for light. They do play an important role as serving as food for organisms. Now, a type of group of vines are called the lianas. They're the woody vines, and they begin on the forest floor as shrubs, and then they have tendrils that will come and ascend the boles.
So we're looking at very thick and dense lianas that are hanging from this tree. And the twists there are kind of a ghost of the plant that it used to wrap around, but is no longer there. When you see lianas so thick, that indicates they're rather old.
Yeah, they can get up to decades in age. And so the tendrils are, of course, going to try and make their way up to the crowns of trees. And then you'll see this loose, dangly business. And what you're seeing here is what the shape of what that liana was wrapping around, but it outlived that plant. Now, they do remain in the ground, and so they are drawing water from the ground. And in fact, if you were to snap these, you'd find that there's a reservoir of water being held in the vessels in their stems. There's a style of plant life called epiphytes. And we find it very commonly in rainforests, especially cloud forests. And those are plants that live on other plants. So they're not internal, they're not parasitically living on it, they're just living on top of, I guess, other plants. And here they are well positioned to trap rain, to trap light, and they can be very, very diverse. So many different things can live epiphytically. Lichens, liverworts, mosses, cacti, ferns, orchids, bromeliads, and they do best in a moist forest.
Cloud forest. See all the epiphytes, the mistiness. It's very damp.
It's amazing how they can hang on, but of course, not all of them can. They do fall. So they trap soil particles that get blown into the canopy, and they use these for their nutrients. Again, they're not connected to the ground or into the tree, so they do need to be resourceful in capturing their nutrients. And they develop a root system that develops around the branches, and it accumulates organic matter as leaves die, etc. It get to be a mat of organic matter that develops here, providing a soil organic litter base for them up there on the tree branch. Now, it can add weight to the tree. And, if there's enough of them, and you saw the wind earlier, it can cause branches to snap. So, but in general, they're not considered to be causing much harm to the tree. They do get first access at water that's dripping down. But there has been incidences of showing where trees create aerial roots into the epiphytic mats, and so they actually are gaining nutrients from the epiphytes that they're holding. A very common type of epiphytes are called bromeliads. Bromeliads are very recognizable by having a rosette of leaves around a central trunk or tank that holds water, and also can hold detritus or dead and decaying matter in its tank. And they could be found terrestrially, or there are examples of epiphytic ones. Very common terrestrial one, of course, is the pineapple. Everybody knows that. So being that it traps water and detritus, it can be a source of water and nutrients for tree frogs and for mosquitoes. They tend to have flowers that grow on long spikes, and the flowers are often red and pollinated by hummingbirds. Now, orchids, beautiful, large family. There's like 25,000 to 35,000 species of orchids of all sizes and shapes and colors. They're just fascinating. And they are recognizable by having a prominent middle petal that's enlarged into what's called a lip. And most, but not all, are epiphytes, as you can see here. They have a bulbous stem that is called a pseudobulb, and the pseudobulb can store water, so that helps out the orchid without there's no consistent supply of water. The roots have a symbiotic relationship with fungus. In fact, they appear white, partly due to that. And the fungus are helpful in helping the orchid get minerals and get water. The orchids are insect pollinated, and most notoriously by bees. And in fact, it can be very, very specific. A certain species of orchid needing a certain species of bee. And that helps the plant because it helps target the pollen and get it to the correct species. Now, there's also the term hemiepiphyte. So they're partially epiphytic, and there's a primary, and we'll talk later, secondary. So the primary hemiepiphytes begin up in the trees. So how they get up there, probably seeds that were dropped by birds or mammals into the tree crown, and they start growing in the crown of the tree. But as they continue to grow, they create tendrils that grow down. And they're going down the tree bowl. These tendrils can fuse, and they're making their way to the soil where they can get more nutrients and water. And most famous, and what you see pictured here, is the strangler fig or the ficus. And what can happen over time is that, if it continues to grow and fuse, it can basically outcompete and outshade the plant that hosted it. So eventually, sometimes you find these hollow because the tree that was within it has died. So it's not strangling it per se, but it is outcompeting and outshading it. So the secondary hemiepiphytes, they are plants that start in the ground. They start rooted, and then they climb up, and as they climb, they create aerial roots into the tree boles, and eventually these will cease to be rooted into the ground, so they'll be exclusively on the tree. All right, catch you next time.